This video will discuss the non-experimental research strategy. So as we said in a previous video, the definition that we're going to go with is that the researcher observes and or records differences between participants with the goal of describing behavior, and that's the non-experimental research strategy. So again, there's a variety of different types of non-experimental research strategies. Remember, we said that they are descriptive, that there is no manipulation involved, and that there is no randomization. And so we're just going to briefly go into some detail on some of the different types: case studies, observational studies, self-reports, correlational studies. And then as we get towards the end of the semester, there are a few chapters that dive into even more detail on these. But I think it's important to just kind of have some of this vocabulary and basic understanding. And then you'll actually go on and do an activity where you'll decide whether some research studies that I present to you are experimental or non-experimental in nature, and then perhaps design some of your own. So the descriptive research strategy, it's describing individual variables rather than a relationship between variables. So it looks at whether it's an individual or a group of individuals, and it describes that a single variable. It could be multiple variables, but it's not looking for a relationship between variables. So an example might be a case study. And again, we've talked about Jeannie, who was found at the age of 13, chained to her bed, and they used her as a case study, and it taught us a lot about how language develops. Then there's naturalistic or laboratory observations. So here is Jane Goodall. She went out to Africa and studied the chimps in the wild, basically. And so that was a very naturalistic type of observation. She wasn't looking at the relationship between variables. She was looking to describe the things that she found. Here might be an example of a laboratory observation where you see someone in a sleep lab hooked up EEGs on their head, getting the heart rate monitor on their finger. And this is where you need a more controlled setting. The correlational research strategy, and this is one I want to make this distinction early on, and we'll come back. There's a whole chapter later on in the end of the semester about the correlational research strategy, is that the correlational research strategy is measuring the relationship between two variables. Now note how that was different than the descriptive research strategy, which was just looking at variables and describing them. Here, with a correlation, we want to know the relationship between two variables. Now this is very different than an experiment, okay? So in an experiment, you're manipulating those variables. So it's measuring the relationship between variables for an individual person, and it is a statistical measure of how strongly two variables are related to one another. And these scatter plots are going to represent this relationship. So each person has two variables that have been measured, and we're looking to see if there's a consistent relationship. As one variable goes up, does the other variable go up? Or as one variable go down, does the other variable go up? Something like that. So we've already seen a little bit about why and how correlations are used, right? One reason is for prediction. So if two variables are correlated, you can use one to predict the other, and that's actually uses a regression analysis. Validity, we've already seen this, right? We've seen how correlations can help test the validity of a new test or tests that are being used for a construct, right? So it can help validate new tests or measurements. We've also seen and talked a little bit about how correlations can be used to see if a test is reliable. And then just looking at theories and theory verification. So we've already seen, why correlations are used. Again, we'll come back at the end of the semester and dive into this in more detail, talk about the statistics involved with the correlation. But I really want to hit home that it's important to understand that correlations, and I've said this before, do not determine cause and effect. But also, if you have an experiment, if you're looking at an experiment and you see that the researcher has manipulated two variables, don't say that there's a correlation between those variables, because that's not what they're looking at. They've taken the time to use random assignment to manipulate a variable, and they want credit for doing an experiment and determining cause and effect relationships. Yes, true, the study has to be replicated, but it's not, if it was a true experiment that was done, even quasi-experimental, there's not a correlation between those variables. So that's something important as you're writing your literature review to keep that in mind. So again, a correlation describes a relationship but does not demonstrate causation. And then we'll also come back and talk about this idea of quasi-experimental research later on. So it's kind of the almost but not quite experiments. So the idea is that the researcher has taken something that's already pre-existing differences and they've kind of dichotomized those. So groups are formed out of convenience rather than random assignment or manipulation. The groups might occur naturally. And so sometimes it's also called a natural experiment. So we'll come back again and talk more about those. I just want to make you aware that those are the other types of kind of non-experimental strategies that are out there.